We will be getting started in just a couple of minutes. We want to give everybody a chance to join, and so please just be patient, and we'll be with you in a minute.
OCO. Welcome, everyone. I've already prayed and offered tobacco before we started, but in our space together today, we will start with a song to bring our hearts and minds together. Wendy, oh, Wendy, oh, Wendy, Wendy, oh, ho, 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 hey, ho, hey, ho, yeah, yeah, yeah. Hey, hey, oh, hey, 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 Wendy, oh, Wendy, oh, Wendy, Wendy, oh, ho, 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 hey, ho, hey, ho, yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Princess, I'm going to hand it to you to share with everybody to help set our intentions today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Princess Poyancy. I wanted to take some time to thank you all for being here and then to invite you all to just take a second to set the intention for this conversation. As we work through the legalities and the bigger conversation, I think it's also important that we acknowledge why we're here. All of my Indigenous ancestors who have lost their life, the culture that has been lost due to colonization, and to the people who continue to fight for our preservation and for our self-determination. So just a few moments, just set that intention and remember why we're here. And again, thank you all for being here and being a part of this important conversation.
Thank you, Princess, and thank you, Melissa, for starting us off in a good way. I'm Jack Trope. I'm a Senior Director in the Indian Child Welfare Program at Casey Family Programs. I'll be the moderator today. For many years before I came to Casey, I worked with the Association on American Indian Affairs and been involved with Indian child welfare for more than 35 years. So it's good to be here with such a great panel that you're going to hear from. So before starting with some panelist presentations and introductions, I just want to sort of set the stage for what you're about to hear today. This webinar is about the Indian Child Welfare Act, as you all know. A very important webinar, very timely webinar. Many of you may know this, but if you don't, ICWA is really the product of the end of a long history, not the end, but a response to a long history of family separation and cultural suppression in Native communities. Many of you may know about the boarding schools and the removal of Indian children to boarding schools in order to assimilate them and destroy their cultural connections and their family connections. It was followed by the Indian Adoption Project, which was a conscious effort in the 1950s and 60s to have Indian children adopted out to non-native homes, mostly in the East and Midwest. And then on top of that, we had state child welfare agencies that were removing children from their homes at astronomical rates. 25 to 35% of Indian children were removed from their homes, 90% placed in non-native, non-relative settings. This finally came to the attention of Congress, and Congress responded by enacting the Indian Child Welfare Act to try to prevent these removals, probably most of which were made without due process and without really any abuse or neglect being present in the home. So that's how we got ICWA. Now at Casey, we call ICWA the gold standard for child welfare. And I'm just going to pull up a little chart, a graph here for you to look at. I know some people are visual learners, so this may help set the stage here. And oops, it's kind of. Well, I hope you can see that. I know on my screen there's a number of things in the way. I'll move this over a little bit. Right, so we call ICWA the gold standard because we think that ICWA, the concepts of ICWA, would be good for every child. It's certainly helpful for Indian children and families, but it would be good for every child. And that's because, first of all, ICWA emphasizes keeping children with their parents whenever possible, with their families. And we know that that is in the best interest of all children when it could be done safely. And that's normally the case. Most removals are for neglect, not abuse. Many people don't know that. Secondly, if children cannot stay with their families, that they ought to be with relatives, with extended family. And certainly in tribal cultures and communities, the idea of extended family and relatives is particularly powerful and important. But of course, that's keeping children with relatives, the research shows, is good for all children, that those children do better, that it's less disruptive, that those placements are steadier, children have fewer mental health and behavioral problems. It's just something that's good for all children. And I would say, by the way, that ICWA, when it was enacted in 1978 and made relatives a placement preference, that was not the way child welfare worked at that time. Really, the opposite was the norm. Long-term foster care with strangers was more the norm. And so ICWA was ahead of its time. And I think the rest of the child welfare system is gradually catching up with ICWA in terms of placement with relatives. And then finally, keeping children connected with their communities and cultures, right? And so that would be good for all children. Keeping children connected with their communities keeps them connected with a network of caring adults. No one has ever said a child has too many caring adults in their life. And culture involves identity, it involves self-worth, it involves resilience. And again, I think particularly in the context of tribal communities, this is even much more powerful. And then the unique part of ICWA that wouldn't apply to all children is tribal involvement, the ability of the tribe to weigh in and have a strong say, hopefully, about what happens to tribal children. And we know that early tribal involvement in cases does lead to increased and faster reunification, and it maintains that connection with relatives, community, and culture, which is in the best interest of all children, and certainly in the best interest of Indian children. But yet we know, even with the Indian Child Welfare Act in place, there's still great disproportionality between the rates of removal of Native children as compared to other children. Native children are removed at 3 times the rate of non-Native children. Certainly it's better than 1978, but it's fallen far short of where it ought to be. And so regardless of what happens in the court case, working to better implement it is vitally important. But as all of you know, and as the main focus of this particular webinar will be to discuss the Supreme Court case. And so in a nutshell, the case involves a constitutional challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act. I'll try to describe this in very non-legal terms, but basically there are three main parts to that challenge. One is that it's beyond Congress's authority to enact this law. Most congressional authority to act comes from the clause in the Constitution called the Indian Commerce Clause, and they're arguing that this clause does not empower Congress to enact ICWA. The second main argument is that ICWA is a race-based statute, and so it violates equal protection of the laws. Normally, Indian statutes have been thought of as politically based on tribal citizenship or membership. but they argue that, in fact, no, this is race-based. And then finally, there's an argument that involves states' rights and the 10th Amendment and whether or not Congress has the right to impose certain requirements on states, particularly on state agencies. So those are the main arguments. Obviously, these present a potential threat to ICWA and the protections for Native children and families. And that's why we've convened this expert panel today to share with you some of their thoughts about the case and its implications and what can be done in response. So with that, I'm now going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly and talk about their experience. I'm going to start with Princess Quiancy. Princess, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Princess Quiancy. I am the eldest daughter of Clark and Gloria Quiancy, the great-granddaughter of Stan Jackson, and the mother of 2 children. I am, my lineage is to the Apache, Hopi, and Zuni tribes. I'm a member of the Yavapai Apache Nation, which is a federally recognized tribe in Arizona, central Arizona. So my experience with ICWA has been both professional and personal. I worked with my nation for a number of years, working with families who struggled with substance abuse and at times were in the position of maybe not being prepared to have their children and what that looked like for them. And then also being the mother of 2 tribal member children, my children have been protected by the ICWA law and have kept us together in instances where, unfortunately, my husband had passed when they were really young and there was other people interested in parenting my children. And so there was that experience. And then also I grew up with siblings in my home that were brought back to the reservation after they were moved from their parents' home in the city of Phoenix. So I have personal and professional experience in both those ways. And that's about all. Thank you.
Thank you, Princess. I'll now ask Alisa Mercado to please introduce herself.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Alisa Mercado, and I'm currently at the Loyola University Chicago Child Law Clinic, where I practice in child protection cases and domestic relations cases. Before that, I'm from the great state of New Mexico, where I practiced Indian law for many years in the Native American program. I practiced in all 23 tribes in New Mexico. We specialized in Indian law issues, and my interest in the Indian Child Welfare Act kind of happened through the cases that would come through on my special project, teaming with doctors and other medical professionals. We had quite a big need for these families who were being separated by guardianships or in child protection cases, and parents needed representation because in guardianship cases in New Mexico, they weren't guaranteed that representation. So I started specializing in those types of removals representing respondent parents who had an Indian Child Welfare Act issue.
Thank you. And finally, introduce Melissa Teehee. Please introduce yourself.
Osio, Wadulisi, Dawado. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, working through Utah State University, occupying the traditional lands of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation. I'm an assistant professor in psychology, director of the Tohi Lab, in which we're focused on holistic Indigenous wellness. I also have a law degree from the University of Arizona and a certificate in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy. And these sort of formalized Western educations help me attend to those issues in which law and policy really have an impact on Indigenous well-being, including identity formation and mental and behavioral health.
Thank you to our panelists. Before I ask the first question, I just remembered I was supposed to start off by letting you know that this is the first of 2 webinars, that the next webinar will take place after the Supreme Court decision so that we can share some of the analysis and follow through that might need to happen as a result of that decision. So Hopefully you will all be able to join us again. I believe most likely it will be in July. I don't think there's been a date actually set yet, or maybe there has been, but it will be in July. So stay tuned. So with that, I'd like to ask the first question, and I'm going to ask Alisa to start off on this, and then hopefully everybody else can weigh in. And that question is, from your experience, what are the key questions that this Supreme Court case raises for us?
Well, I think Jackie did a really excellent overview of the challenges that are before the court right now. And again, not to get too in the weeds when it comes to legal issues, but it's important to know that this is not the first time that the Indian Child Welfare Act has been before the Supreme Court. It has the potential of being, I guess, the most dangerous case to be in front of the Supreme Court, because this case, in addition to impacting the Indian Child Welfare Act, has the potential of impacting a lot of different areas of Indian law that practitioners in this area are very familiar with, in particular issues involving tribal sovereignty. How I see this particular case and the key issues that it has brought before the Supreme Court, this seems like the progression of a very tactical approach to finding the Indian Child Welfare Act unconstitutional. They found this particular family in a particular state, in a particular jurisdiction, that does not like the Indian Child Welfare Act, and it was almost guaranteed to go in front of a specific judge, where that specific judge was very likely to challenge the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act, and then brought us here today. This, of course, bringing it back to a more individual level, seems like the progression of what I was seeing in state courts when I was representing parents who had separated families. It was always a fight to get the Indian Child Welfare Act recognized and followed, and tribes notified and involved in the state court process. One of the common things that I would see in court is other parties, whether it's interested parties who wanted to take children away from parents or adopt children outside of their Indian family, was that if you take these children to the reservation, they will never come back. It is a land of lawlessness, and which is absolutely untrue as somebody who practices in tribal courts, but it's something that you would consistently have to push back on in state courts. So those are some of the issues I'd say I see that are before us today.
I put myself on mute. Thank you, Alisa. Princess, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so for me, I think that some of the key issues that this case raises, should SCOTUS decide that this is no longer going to be in existence, is that what we've seen historically with Native American people is that we continue to suffer from the dismantling of our biopsychosocial circle. And so as we move into these different spaces and this happens, I don't see this being helpful in the longevity of the people on the human level, right? Like, I know that we're talking about law and those sorts of things, but the people that are involved with this, the children that are involved with this, the families that are involved with this, on the other side of this, continue to not have a space to exist. We historically have not, I'm sure as we talk about boarding schools, we've all heard of kill the Indian, save the man, right? And this hasn't worked because Native American people are not allowed to be Native American. We're not allowed to be Indigenous, but we're also don't ever meet the standard of the non-Native outside arena. So as this happens, where they're pushing our children into these arenas and pushing our children into this assimilation, which we know historically hasn't worked, and continuing to push that agenda. So when I think of the key issues that this raises, it raises exponentially for me the things that have continued to plague us from these traumas: addiction, family dysfunction on telling of my community. And I know that we hear this word sovereignty thrown around a lot, but we've never really been sovereign. Like Native Americans we're not sovereign. We're still, the federal courts still have supremacy over us. And I think that it really pulls away from our self-determination. And what does that do to an entire population of people? So for me, those are the key issues that this case raises, is what happens to us post this, what happens to our ability to take care of ourselves, and what we've been trying to do in the way of reestablishing our communities and reestablishing our families.
Thank you, Princess. Melissa?
Yeah, I think to add on, the bigger picture has been mentioned here, right? This is an attack on tribal sovereignty overall, which technically in words exists, but is this domestic dependent nation. But it's all part of this continued systematic attack to eradicate tribes and tribal sovereignty. So if you can remove the children, such as in the boarding school era, when children were ripped from their families and attempted to be assimilated as white. I mean, this has been going on and on and on. In this case in particular, it's hard to make big governmental political change without big money. And there's big money in adoption. In a business sense, there's a high demand of newborns and a small number of children whose parents are ready to have them be adopted. There were laws that were changed in other countries where children were being adopted, where a high percentage of children were being adopted and brought into the US. And so when that law changed, it didn't allow for that, then one of the go-to places was to look at Native children. So in thinking about that, sort of what has brought these pieces together in a way to have the movement that it has, right? It has been systematic. It has been very purposeful in how it has been brought. But when we think about sort of the key issues, we like thinking about the children and families that are involved, the tribes that are involved, right? We know as psychologists how important identity formation is. And that part of that identity formation is understanding your culture. And this is one more way to sort of remove Native kids from their culture. And we know that, as Princess was saying, those things lead to a lot of more negative coping strategies. And we also know that engaging in your culture and really sort of having that self-esteem of who you are and who your family is can lead to wonderful outcomes longer into life. So there are key issues on many, many different levels here happening all at one time.
Thank you, Melissa. I'd like to sort of follow up on some of this, and I know you've kind of addressed this already, but question I want to ask is, what is the potential impact of the upcoming decision on the overall well-being of Indigenous children, families, and communities? You've all touched on that some in your last answer, but Princess, I may start with you to see if there's anything else you'd like to add on that topic.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chope, part of that cut out. Could you?
Sure. So I was asking the potential impact of the upcoming decision on the overall well-being of Indigenous children, families, and communities. Anything else you'd want to add? I know you already spoke to it a little bit.
Yeah. So additionally, my experience has been that I think, Melissa, you had said that when a child self-identity is super important, and that's important for how our children develop, how they relate in the world, how they relate to others, their behaviors they exhibit. And so what I've seen in my line of work up to date is that when Indigenous children are placed with non-Indigenous families and that understanding isn't there and that community isn't there and the support isn't there, the children will start to have outward behaviors, or what's the right word that I'm trying to put this in? We'll have behaviors that are undesirable, right? And so when this happens, these families who have adopted them can't handle it anymore. These children are ending up in group homes, and they're ending up on medications, and there's ending up in situations where the families have kind of just said, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. They've have too many problems, or we're not relating, or whatever this looks like, and I'm done. And now these children are in a stateside system, disconnected from their communities, disconnected from their families, disconnected from the resources that Indigenous communities provide, and are left to fend for themselves stateside. And it's scary. It's scary when they turn 18 and children are being kicked out of jails, and children are being told at midnight that they have to leave group homes, and they're not getting the resources that they would have if they were still connected with their communities and connected with their tribes. So I think that the potential that should this ruling turn out that ICWA is no longer there, that's one of the hugest impacts that we'll have is on the children. The children are going to be out of our communities and disconnected and away from their families and away from the resources.
Princess, you've frozen, at least on my screen. Has she frozen on others' screen? Yes. Okay, well, I don't know if you can hear me, Princess, but we'll kind of move on to one of the others, and hopefully you can address your technical issue. So Alisa or Melissa, is there anything you'd like to add to what Princess was saying in regard to the impact on overall well-being?
Well, to add to what Princess was talking about, how it's really affecting the well-being of the children, it's also impacting the well-being of the tribe as a whole and the community as a whole. And I noticed that there are quite a few people here in the webinar today who are from New Mexico, and I'm reminded of the Pueblo of Zia, which I think that their current enrollment is less than 1,500 members. And if you remove Zia children from the Pueblo of Zia, there's no more effective way to destroy a tribe than to remove their children from that tribe and systematically take away that connection they have with their community. And the community as a whole is going to lose that portion of itself by these removals. And the Indian Child Welfare Act, as we addressed earlier, it was an act of Congress meant to address this specific issue on how children are being removed. Native American children are being removed at an exponential rate compared to their white counterparts.
Thank you, Alisa. Before I ask Melissa if she'd like to add anything, I should say that I know this has been put in the chat, but let me make clear, if there will be a question and answer opportunity at the end of, after all the presentations, after we've finished our discussion. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. That would be the easiest for us to, so we can try to answer as many questions as possible. So with that, Melissa, would you like to add to this conversation?
Sure. I mean, I think when we look at healing practices, when we look at sort of how do we heal from trauma, so many things as Indigenous folks goes back to our culture, goes back to, it's not an individual healing. It's healing that happens with others, right? We are not alone. We are not sort of independent, right, in this world. So we are interdependent, and healing has to be interdependent. And so part of that is when you start tearing families apart or communities, because it is both, full healing cannot happen either way for the person that's been removed or the people that are there. And I mean, it just continues to perpetuate this trauma, this harm, the historical trauma that's brought up from this happening for generations. And I saw somebody put an article in the chat about sort of the health outcomes, just physical health and mental health, spiritual health outcomes related to these removals.
Yes, and please feel free to look at the chat. I know there people are posting some good information in there. Melissa, I'd like to stay with you on this. So, of course, we don't know what the Supreme Court is going to do. We all hope that they will uphold ICWA, but if they don't, we don't know if they will invalidate it entirely or just certain sections of it. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. So how should we be preparing for this?
I mean, for one of the things to start with is awareness. So I think, trying to hold events like this, but also writing to our Congress people, thinking creatively with our tribal nations on what this means. Yeah, that's a big question. Ultimately, the decision, though we don't have it yet, has already been made. And so the things we can do is get ready to prepare for what the outcome is going to be. And I will say the outcome is not going to be to keep everything in place. The Supreme Court has consistently, historically, over time, whittled away at tribal sovereignty every time. So if it's not a full dismantling, something will be coming down from tribal sovereignty generally. And I think maybe Alyssa could speak more to this aspect.
My experience is as an attorney who takes these types of cases. So I would say, from that aspect, if you are an attorney, if you are close to an attorney, to take these types of cases, to take Indian Child Welfare Act cases and really push ICWA to be applied in every case that it possibly can apply to. In some states, there are guardianship acts. New Mexico is one of them. There are other states across the country where parents don't have right of counsel in those types of cases. And the Indian Child Welfare Act is a very complicated federal law. And it really matters if you have an attorney who's advocating for a party. So first of all, I'd say if you're an attorney, to just take those type of cases, take them on appeal, anything like that. If you are not an attorney, as Melissa said, awareness really does help. If you are a mental health professional, it really helps to be in conversation with attorneys, whether they represent parents or they represent children, or they're a guardian ad litem who's not an attorney, and really educate that attorney on how the kids are doing, how you can best support that family to reunify. Because there are so many areas that, maybe attorneys are just not familiar with, and it really helps to learn from a medical professional exactly how they would address certain issues, and it will impact the legal aspect, and as a team to help these families holistically. It really helps to be in conversation with everybody involved.
Princess, would you like to add anything?
Yeah.
I know you were knocked off for a few minutes, but feel free to finish your last response if there's anything that you had wanted to say before you got cut off, but also if you have any thoughts about how we should be preparing for this, that would be great.
I'm not sure where it cut off on the last one, but the gist of what I was saying is that when our children are disconnected from their community, they don't have the resources or the family that's available there. And that's, I think, really important for long-term success, long-term health, and those types of things. In terms of like what we can do, I was a little bit reading the chat as we were responding. And I think someone in there was like, what do we do? How do we reclaim our communities? Like, how do we prepare for this? And I think that what that looks like is, when we see people arranging for counsel, we take our place. When we see people coming to the table, come to these conversations, when we see these cases coming through, each one of us need to show up and remember that these are real life people, and this is a real life community. And this is something that's very, very real and very impactful across our communities. I think that from so there's a portion of me that wants to speak from a professional because we're in this professional setting, but more than I am a professional, I'm an Indigenous woman, I'm a Native American woman, I'm a mother, I'm a sister. So what we do is that we show up and we continue to push the conversation. What we do is we continue to say, hey, you know what? This is what healing looks like. This is what healing looks like with non-Indigenous people and with Indigenous people. These are the things that we say, and we say it always. We don't just say it when it's appropriate. We just don't say it when we're with the right friends. We say this is a real thing and this is how we fight for it and this is what it looks like. And I don't think that anybody in this room is the end of the conversation or the beginning of the conversation, but we have to be mindful of how we are in this conversation. So I think that's how we prepare for that, and how we continue to move forward is building Indigenous communities up so that they are prepared for this, so that regardless of what comes out of this, we have healthy families before our children are even ending up in stateside or federal side situations, and that we know our resources. We know who is available to us, what lawyers are there for us, who is able to advocate for us, and we're able to tap those resources. Yeah, so I think that's how we should prepare for this is being ready to stand in this thing independently, regardless of what SCOTUS says, that as a community, whether it's the legal community, the mental health community, or an Indigenous community, that we're pushing that agenda. That's what we're there for.
Thanks. I'd like to, follow up in a certain way. So I know that some of the people who are participants here are either tribal people or connected with the tribe necessarily. And so we know that a number of the theories in this case would, even if the federal law is invalidated, we know that there may still be a lot of space for state activity. And we know, of course, we have things like state ICWAs, we have things like ICWA courts, we have things like, various tribal state agreements around ICWA, that kind of thing. And sort of understanding, I think generally, you think all of us would understand that when something happens at with the Supreme Court case, that the tribes will need to take the lead into figuring out the best response. But I'm sure we have plenty of people on this call who are wondering, well, how can we be allies? How can we support tribal efforts and the efforts of those who are directly impacted by the Indian Child Welfare Act after a Supreme Court decision that might have some negative impact on the Indian Child Welfare Act and the protections in the law? And I just kind of open it up to any of you to start that conversation.
Well, I think Jackie mentioned one of the important aspects, state ICWA laws. And for those of you who aren't familiar with state ICWA laws, it varies across the board depending on what state you're in. But the idea is that it's the state equivalent that mirrors the federal law. It's not a perfect fix, but it's a Band-Aid. If federal ICWA is found unconstitutional, there will be states across the United States, very similar to when Roe v. Wade was found unconstitutional, that will have a state equivalent in recognizing an Indian child's connection with their tribe, with their community, and with their parents. And so, of course, the protections are going to vary across the board. In states where you have strong tribal state judicial consortiums, where you have strong partnerships with tribes, you're going to have a lot more tribal input in what that legislation looks like. I believe North Dakota recently just passed a state ICWA law. So there's a handful of states who are recognizing the special relationship that Indian children have with their community. And it's important, if you are in that arena, to support efforts by your state representatives to push bills like that through.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, excuse me if somebody already said this, but New Mexico passed the Indian Family Protection Act. And they did that because of these cases coming. And so it was the New Mexico Tribal Indian Child Welfare Consortium, the New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department, the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, and another group called Bold Futures that really came together, right? That allyship of bringing a lot of people together on a single issue is that they worked to sort of consider what drafting this could look like and what that would mean. And so that has passed and been signed into law at this point in time as well.
And although I'm the moderator, I'll just add, since I'm in Colorado, that we just had a Colorado ICWA enacted too that was pushed by both tribes, urban Indian advocates, and members of the child welfare community. So these things are happening in a number of places right now. Princess, would you like to join in the conversation?
I feel like both of these ladies said it very well. Elisa, yeah. So there isn't much more that I have to add on top of that. I think that's what it looks like. We have to come, like I said previously, we have to come together. It has to look like us coming together and being prepared to have the uncomfortable conversations, being prepared to show up for things that maybe before we thought somebody else would handle, or maybe the conversation could happen at someone else's table. But now it's time that we all show up and fight for it. That's, for lack of a better way to say it, is that we have to all show up and fight. We have to all be there. We all have, I think, really important parts of the conversation belong to all of us, whether you're somebody in the community, you're a family coordinator, you're a physician, you're a lawyer, all of us together, like Melissa was saying, like New Mexico did, a lot of people coming together, a lot of different entities and agencies coming together and making these changes on the state level, because that's what it's going to look like with Roe v. Wade.
So I know we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but I think maybe we should look. I see there's 11 questions in the question and answer in the Q&A. So why don't we look at some of those and have a dialogue based on what people are asking about. So I'm just going to open them up here. And so the first question is, what can we do to influence this Supreme Court decision? That's a tough one. Anybody want to try to respond to that?
Well, at this point, we're waiting for the Supreme Court's decision to come down. I think that our support would best go to, is best placed in our communities, in our tribal communities, in supporting whatever local tribal community that you live near or you work in, and helping them to get the resources to really push ICWA cases if there's a state equivalent. If ICWA is found to be constitutional, but there are other limitations, I think it's really going to depend. But so I would just say, just generally, just support your local tribal communities and those who work in them.
And I just want to follow up here too, because I think what I hear you saying is that it's also the narrative that's important, right? That what the discussion is like after the case comes down will influence how people react to it, right? So, could any of you sort of do any of you have thoughts about how people can help impact that narrative that will be so important in determining what the next steps are after the decision?
I think perspective is important. And when we have these discussions and we talk about it, I think how we've heard it so far is that this poor, unfortunate family really just wanted to take really great care of these Indigenous children, and poor her and poor this family without very much conversation about what is happening to the children and what the perspective of the children is and what the perspective of the Indigenous community is. So I think that the way that we support it is by having the conversation from all perspectives. When we're talking about it, we're not just talking about it from the perspective of just the people who've brought it to the case. We're talking about the perspectives of the children that are involved. We're talking about the perspectives of the community that's involved. And when we talk about fairness and race and all of these different things, you know, one of the things that I've said before is that we've paid for this. The land that everyone's on, we paid for this. The ancestors I don't have anymore, we paid for this. The kids that don't speak their language anymore, or a lot of the ceremonies that are lost, or the songs that are lost, our cultures, we paid for this. So this isn't a matter of being fair or unfair or racist or not racist. It's a matter of this is ours, and this is a treaty that they're breaking again. This is a promise that the government again is breaking when it comes to us. So I think that's how we talk about it. We talk about it in truth, and we talk about it with passion, and we talk about it from the perspectives of everyone, not just the families who brought it up, the children, the communities, and the fact that Indigenous people have paid for this. We've paid for our families to be together. We've paid for our communities. You know, we look at America and we're speckled across these little tiny pieces of land. There's nowhere else in this country that we can go, or in this world that we can go and land somewhere and be around people who look like us, that maybe in a generation will assimilate to us. This is ours. We've paid for it. They shouldn't be taking it from us again. They shouldn't be taking our children from us continuously, not again, but continuously. So I think that's how we talk about it. That's how we impact people. We be honest about it, about who it affects and the way it affects them.
Thank you. I think that's a very powerful message. There's another question that sort of is along the same lines, and so maybe you've already answered this, but I'll sort of put it out there in case it generates any additional thought. And that is, how do we stand up as communities and reclaim that we are capable of taking care of our own children in tribal communities? You know, you've kind of what you're speaking to already, but is that question generate any additional thoughts from anybody?
We do it. How do we do this? We do it. We show up and we do it. We network, we talk to each other, we show up for things like this. When we hear the conversation coming, we're not too tired. We're there. We support each other. We just do it. And I know that that sounds weird, and I know that it sounds like too simple, but we do. We don't hope for it. We know we're going to do it. We don't. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Makes perfect sense. I think that that's a great answer. Do it. And I know that the resources are scarce in some areas of the country, particularly when you are dealing with issues of poverty. I've represented parents who are living in absolute poverty, and you have to beg for experts. And I've had a lot of luck with doctors and psychologists and caseworkers and just experts across the field who are willing to provide their services pro bono in cases like this. And I think that that's really important, that no matter what your specialty is, that you offer up your services to those who need it in these types of cases, because resources really are scarce. And it's hard to find experts in this field. And I think that there are probably a lot of experts who have joined the webinar today and, you know, just don't even realize that they're experts. Whether you are an elder in your tribal community, it's important to have that perspective. You know, attorneys can really use that perspective in a case where they need to prove whatever is coming in. But it really helps to have those connections and to really just do whatever needs to be done for your community.
Hey, Melissa, unless you have anything, I'll move on to the next question. Would you like to add anything? No? Okay. So the next question is, and it's sort of two questions. I'll combine them into one. And that is, there are some states that are no longer allowing race to be discussed in schools. And if people can no longer talk about the history of these atrocities, how can people in those states understand this case and know about why it is such a big problem?
I think,
go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think supporting independent education outreach and providing those and being a part of that, because the school system, if we look at it historically, whether you're Indigenous or African American or any type of minority, the school system has never been built to tell our truth. It's been built to tell someone else's truth. And we've seen that. That's always kind of been that way. I think that, you know, I remember being in school and them telling us about ways that the land was exchanged and those sorts of things. So people in those states are going to have to find those places of independent education, independent research, because again, depending on the school systems, the public school systems to do that for us. I mean, I think we've always known it's not there. I mean, we'll find sectors, we'll find classes that provide those niche perspectives, but it's thinking outside the box and finding it.
Melissa, you had wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say also, if we take the language from the US government, right, these things could still be discussed because it is discussing different nations' interactions, right? These sovereign nations' interactions. So this history still could be told, but as Princess said, it currently isn't being told that way. I have research that I've done and gathered all the materials for the state of Utah, right? And the percentage that are of lessons in 4th through 6th grade that are ever presented from an Indigenous point of view is very low. And so, yeah, it's already not happening prior to these laws, but it could be done.
Thank you. So let me move on to the next one. And that question is, can we press for attorneys who practice on or near reservation to have this knowledge? Can tribes have curriculum and a certificate program that helps non-Indigenous people to understand this critical element of our well-being? Somebody like to?
Yeah, I mean, there are tribes that have certificates. In order to practice there, you have to take some cultural classes, some history, and pass an exam similar to passing the bar exam. So that certainly can be done. It's harder to do for tribes that are smaller. And so at times tribes will come together and form the Colorado Indian tribes, right? To bring together some resources for those who are close in land base as a way to do some of those things.
And I do know that some law schools, I think Mitchell Hamlin in Minnesota is one that is specifically putting together curricula around this and bringing in tribal people as part of that curricula. So there may be opportunity for some to include this in formal legal training as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, we move on to the next question. What specific recommendations would you give policymakers interested in Native child welfare?
My general recommendation, I think, to a policymaker would be to talk to the people that it affects, to speak to caseworkers who take these types of cases, to attorneys who practice in this area, to tribes who have children who have been removed, just to speak directly to who this involves. I know it seems such general advice, but really there's no better way to understand what's at stake and the issues that are present than speaking to the people who it directly affects.
And I think that when it comes to policy writers, is that when we move through these things, we keep an open mind for understanding that Indigenous communities operate in a way that that is different, that is not assimilated. That I think that's been one of the biggest struggles with the federal government and us, is that we've never fully assimilated. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud that we still hold some of our multi-generational community raising keys. And so as policymakers, that we keep an open eye and an open heart and open mind to what the community says they need, not what we think they need.
And I think we've seen that with some of these recent state ICWAs, where the community stepped up and said, this is what we want. And policymakers didn't respond everywhere. Some states they did not succeed, but in a number of states they did. So I think that's great advice. And I also will just add, I think after the decision comes down, there might be some more specific policies that might be fairly clear, that might present themselves once we know what the court does. So that's a pitch to attend part 2 of this later after the decision. Okay. Next question. I've been asked to make recommendations on how to keep our children in the community despite this a Supreme Court decision. How can this be done? Somebody like to tackle that one?
I think the first step is to know what law applies in your state. If you are in a state that has, well, right now we have ICWA, we have federal. So if you have attorneys that are working with you on these types of cases, or if you're an attorney yourself, to really know what's available to your client, whether that's the tribe or the child or one of the parents, what's available under federal ICWA to this family. If we've reached a point where ICWA has been found unconstitutional and we're relying on the state equivalent, to know what state law you have available to you. If you're in New Mexico, it's NIFPA. If you're in Minnesota, I think it's MIFPA, Minnesota Indian Families Protection Act. And across the board, they have different names, but usually it's Indian Family Protection Act, and they mirror the federal ICWA. So just to know what you have available to you, and to really get to know the tribe that is present in this particular case. If they have a robust social service agency who are very involved, if they have caseworkers, what they have available within the tribe, what they're able to provide in terms of expert witnesses, or if they can provide resources, or just know what's available by contacting people. And I've just called a governor's office before and said, I have this tribal member that I'm representing. I'm trying to get in touch with the social service agency in your tribe. Can you point me in the right direction? And I've never had anybody in a governor's office say no and hang up on me. They usually give me a number, or they say, yeah, that's so-and-so, hold on, I'm gonna go get them. And you can hear them in the background yelling for that person. So it's possible to find the right person. It just might take a little bit more legwork.
I agree with everything you said, Elisa. And then additionally, many of these children belong to multiple tribes. Maybe the tribe that they're affiliated with is not the tribe they're enrolled with, or maybe the tribe they're enrolled with is not somebody who has that resource. So knowing also that there's multiple options. And then even when it comes to our nation has medical centers on there and behavioral health specialists and other resources that belong to all Indigenous people. If you are an Indigenous person, you can come to these facilities, you can get this help, even though you're not a member of my nation. So I think that's the other way as well, or additionally.
Yeah, I was going to say also, be willing to foster in emergency situations that are needed, right? For if outside of the home placement is deemed necessary at the time, and you are Native, be open to some of those short-term placements, knowing that the goal is to get back with the family. That's something that the Cherokee Nation has done and reached out for, to find people who are willing to foster in emergency situations around the country, because there are Cherokee Nation citizens all over the country.
Which actually, that answer ties into another one of these questions. So I'll ask it and see if there's any additional discussion you'd all like to have. And this question was, how do we engage tribal communities or members to take care of their own? Sometimes it is difficult to find homes for our children, so they end up going to non-native homes. This is difficult on the ground. Any creative ideas on how to do this? Do we have to pay relatives? So sort of ties into, Melissa, what you were just talking about. Would anybody like to expand upon that based on that question?
I think we could maybe get creative if resources or if you're worried that people aren't involved enough in this issue. I think that being the person to push a tribal state judicial consortium, if one doesn't already exist in your state, so that you can have tribal leaders, governors, lieutenant governors at the table with state representatives, so that you can build those strong ties and everybody can be aware of what's at stake and the issues at play. I think that that's a great step if that doesn't already exist in your state.
Anybody else?
I think, sorry, I was
sorry,
just going to add.
Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, I mean, those, depending on how close-knit your tribe is, right? But some of those phone calls from people in the tribe to say, this is the situation, can you take somebody in for this amount of time? I mean, those just direct phone calls, rather than waiting for me to go fill out an application saying that I want to do this, right? But when it's an emergency situation, I think people are more likely to open their doors and or don't know that it's an option to, there's not all tribes have an application process for these placements.
Yeah, and I would go ahead, Princess. Go ahead.
And I was going to say, and also too, advocating for programs to come in and teach about healthy families, teach about how to be a foster parent. What does that look like? What happens? Is there a stipend that's involved? What do those stipends need to be used for? How do you keep a clean house? But really building that strong foundation in the community I feel like we'll have more families prepared for an emergent situation. We know we have X amount of families who participate in whatever program, but getting those into the community sometimes requires us advocating or talking to our colleagues or going to tribal governments and saying, hey, I know these people that provide this resource or that can come in and do these classes, maybe grant or something like that, but bringing the education to the community and preparing the community for it.
Thank you. And I'll just mention, by the way, there was a recent proposal from the federal government to make it easier for relatives to get licensed so they could receive federal funding. So that might be something to keep an eye out for. I know that a lot of the licensing requirements have felt inappropriate for relatives. And so we'll see what they come up with. Maybe they'll make it a little easier to get some of those payments as well. Okay, I move on to the next question. And that is, what would you like physicians who rotate through IHS or other sites with Indigenous families to know about their role in keeping Indigenous children in Indigenous families and communities?
So I think that what I would like for you to know and what your role is that to ask questions. Sometimes when we see things in front of us that may not seem normal or common to us, doesn't mean that it's not common or normal for that family. when I first came on here, I talked about how I have personal experience with ICWA. My parents throughout our life fostered 47 different children, and I believe fully adopted 4, many that were from the city that came back to the community. And at one point that required a lot of social workers in our house and a lot of people asking us questions and how do your parents handle this? How do you parents handle that? And without divulging too much about my family and our cultural beliefs, one of the things that had come about was that in order for us to have this healing, we had to all eat out of the same bowl for dinner every night, right? Like this big bowl was put in the middle. Didn't matter what mom cooked, and we all ate off of the same bowl, and we shared community and time. And we had a non-Indigenous provider come into the house and really take this stance of that my parents were not doing this correctly. Then that led to an investigation, and my sister and I shared a bed, which, dad ended up getting us tuned. We still went back to the same bed, but had they asked us questions on why we were all eating out of the same bowl, or why we slept in the same bed, or why we did the things that we did, I think that it would have changed the way that they reported about us. So as a physician who rotates these different places, I think your role is to ask questions and to really be open-minded that these communities have different beliefs and different ways. And maybe sometimes it doesn't necessarily look normal to you, but ask why. And I think from those answers, you'd be able to determine whether or not, how you're reporting something, how you're writing it down, and what you're reporting. So.
Yeah, I think to add to that, it's to move out of judgment and towards understanding, because those two things are on opposite ends of a continuum. You can't have judgment and understand at the same time. So moving into that really like respectful curiosity place, and the questions that you ask is one of the best things you can do to understand more. But the second I hear judgment, right, as a patient, right, then I'm like, I'm done. I'm done engaging with this. You're judging me. And so I think being very thoughtful about how you are approaching those things.
And remembering how we feel towards this. So historically, our relationship to outside entities hasn't been that they're there to help. It hasn't been there that they're there to provide us care, or even if it's as a physician, healthcare. We haven't necessarily had a relationship that's very trusting. So also keeping that in mind is that sometimes when people are closed off, or a child's not talking to you, or even they're not making eye contact with you, it's not evidence of something maladaptive. It's evidence of their culture. And kind of like Melissa said, having that respectful curiosity, and also remembering what the relationship looks like and how they might be viewing you in your white coat as a doctor, even though you're there just to help. That might not be their experience, even historically or personally.
Thank you. We just have a few more questions. We have a few more minutes, so that works well. There is a question about finding information about state ICWAs, and I will just say I have some information I'm happy to provide to the organizers, and I think Alisa, I believe, does too, if I remember correctly. But in any event, I think we can get that information hopefully available in some form to all of you all. So I won't answer that directly now. But the next question, yes, sorry.
I can quickly put in the chat a link to the Turtle Talk blog, which has a page where it includes all of the state ICWA laws, if anybody wants to take a look at that.
That would be great. Okay, so you can get that as well, and we can also provide information. Okay, but the next question, a couple more that I hopefully can get to. One is, what is the likelihood that the 21 amicus briefs in support of ICWA will make much difference? And let me just say, for those of you who don't know about the 21 amicus briefs, there were briefs from everything from states. There were 23 states that signed a brief supporting the bill. There were almost 500 tribes that submitted a brief, which is unheard of. Our organization, Casey Friendly Programs, submitted a brief on behalf of 26 child welfare and adoption organizations in support of ICWA, and there were many, many more. So I think this is the basis for that question. Would anybody like to address the effect of amicus briefs on the court?
I think Jackie might be the best person to do that, but I'll say generally, I hope it's a good impact. I think that the more support you show for an act is going to be, I mean, I hope that it's a good impact. I mean, it's amazing, like Jack said, unprecedented, and to have that much support, you would hope that it would impact the decision.
Yeah, I will say the breadth of the support here from states as varied as Idaho and South Dakota to California and Massachusetts is fairly unusual in these cases. But again, we never really know for sure. Okay, I pick up another question here. Somebody said that they provided psychological services to a young Native man who was placed in a non-Native home along with his younger sister. There was so much physical abuse that he and his sister suffered at the hands of their foster home were very traumatic. This is not an isolated case. That being said, are these types of issues brought out when arguing the harm being done to our Native children in addition to removing the children from their people and culture?
So in my line of work, I work with a lot of children who are in state custody. And unfortunately, the unique part of that isn't the abuse. The abuse happens across the board. And I wish that I could say that that's not happening to all children, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So with that being said, I think that everyone kind of knows it, but is it the key part of the conversation? Is it the key part of the argument? I mean, I haven't seen it. I don't know if you other ladies have seen. I mean, it comes up in the conversation, but because it is so common, I don't know how much weight it holds there. Or I hate to put it that way.
Elisa, Melissa, would you like to add something?
I agree with Princess that, you know, you don't always see it as the center of the conversation when a lot of it should be. As, you know, as a practitioner in law, you try and get that message out for your clients on how this could potentially impact the rest of their life. It can be difficult to do in litigation, and I think that that's why I was really focused earlier on, you know, how can you be an ally? Well, you can be an ally by talking to attorneys and letting them know from your expert opinion how this is going to impact the children for the rest of their life, how your tribe operates, what traditions you have. All of those, all of that knowledge can be brought into litigation through the use of witnesses, and it's helpful to have judges or other attorneys or whoever is present in this litigation hear that information, because a lot of people are very unfamiliar with these types of issues, and you're really starting from no knowledge in a lot of cases. And so it really helps to have a lot of allies in different areas of professions, whether it's medical or psychological or whatever it is.
Okay, well, we appear to be out of time. So I want to, I think we got to almost all the questions. I know there were one or two we probably didn't, so I apologize for that. But I hope this was helpful today. I certainly learned a lot by listening to our panelists, and hopefully you did too. And we invite you again to join us for the second webinar that will take place after the court decision. And so with that, have a good rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you again in July.
Melissa, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Melissa. You were doing the closing.
Yeah.
My,
No,
I
just
am
doing it.
so sorry.
I was just playing as
Yes.
everybody was leaving. No, that's
Sure.
fine.
Go ahead.
Rado?